Back in session. Welcome to meeting number 41, House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. We're starting off with the start to our Buy Canada study. We've got 1 hour with PSPC. We're going to suspend for a few moments and then go over to Treasury Board. Mr. Laporte, welcome back. I understand you have opening statement for us. Go ahead. Floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. With me today are Levant Osmoutlou, Director General for Strategic Policy, and Clinton Lawrence-White, Director General by Canadian Small and Medium Enterprises and Digital Solutions. I would like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to open the discussion on the Buy Canadian policy, the policy's importance, and the components of the framework.
Strength and resilience have been tested by an increasingly uncertain global environment, including evolving trade pressure and tariffs, as well as ongoing disruption to international businesses and industry supply chains. These challenges have highlighted the importance of maintaining a strong, resilient, and diversified domestic economy. In order to strengthen domestic supply chain and reduce our reliance on foreign inputs, opportunities remains to more intentionally prioritize Canadian suppliers, content, and materials such as steel, aluminum, and various wood products. L'an dernier, le Premier ministre a annoncé que la
Last year, the Prime Minister announced the Buy Canadian policy as one of many initiatives announced by the Government of Canada to strengthen the Canadian economy by bringing new opportunities, access, and direct benefits to Canadian industry. Public Services and Procurement Canada has a key role in the rollout of the Buy Canadian policy, which came into force on December 16, 2025. As the Government of Canada's central purchasing agent, PSPC is uniquely positioned to use procurement as a strategic lever. With PSPC averaging $37.8 billion in annual contracting, shifts in how we evaluate bids and define requirements can have a significant impact on domestic investment, supply chain resilience, and industrial capacity.
Designed to address the challenges Canada faces currently in a targeted way by strengthening initiatives for Canadian suppliers and increasing the use of Canadian-produced materials in key procurement. The Buy Canadian policy contains two overarching components. The first is the policy on prioritizing Canadian materials in federal procurement. This component is designed to protect and support domestic supply chain for key strategic commodities. Notre objectif est d'accroître l'intégration des matériaux produits.
Our goal is to increase the integration of materials produced in Canada, reduce dependency on foreign inputs, and require companies to source materials produced in Canada, including steel, aluminum, and wood products.
Canadian policy is the policy on prioritizing Canadian suppliers and Canadian content and strategic federal procurement. This component advances the Government of Canada's mission to build a strong and diversified Canadian economy. It encourages the participation of Canadian suppliers and incentivizes the use of Canadian content in strategic procurement. Ce volet comprend deux éléments complémentaires.
This component includes two complementary elements. It fosters the participation of Canadian suppliers by giving them a price-based evaluation credit during the offer evaluation process, and requires all bids to be evaluated based on the level of Canadian content or value added they propose.
To competitive procurement of $25 million or more, with the threshold of application for the policy on prioritizing Canadian suppliers and Canadian content and strategic federal procurement dropping to $5 million in June of this year. En conclusion, SPAC est chargé d'appuyer la politique acheté canadien en veillant à ce qu'elle soit mise en œuvre.
PSPC will continue to support the Buy Canadian policy by ensuring consistent implementation through the establishment of clear guidance,
manufacturers and suppliers, and to build lasting relationships that will drive demand for Canadian goods, services, and materials. As it stands today, the Buy Canadian policy has already applied to a portfolio of solicitations valued at over $3 billion, resulting in the awards of contract worth over $525 million to date. Finalement, Monsieur le Président, la politique acheté canadien change.
In closing, Chair, the Buy Canadian policy is changing the way government and industry work together. As the Government of Canada, federal organizations, and Crown adopt these new measures, PSPC is in full support of this transformation, and we are pleased to answer any questions you have about the policy and its rollout. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Laporte. We'll start with Mrs. Block for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Laporte, and to your officials who have joined you. I'm very much looking forward to the launch of this very important study. I'm looking for some really concise answers from you in the questions that I'm going to be asking. How much does the Government of Canada spend on procurement annually?
For PSPC, it's $37.5 billion on average for the last 3 years.
And the government?
The Government of Canada, this is a question that it really kind of depends every year, but I can say that government procurement at large, when we include province, territories, accounts for 14% of the GDP. But I don't have visibility.
You don't have the exact
procurement
number
data,
for the Government of Canada? Okay. According to Canada Buys, in 2023-24, more than 93% of all contract value was awarded to suppliers with Canadian addresses. Under Buy Canadian, can you tell us how many suppliers who received contracts with Canadian addresses will no longer be eligible to bid on procurements?
Okay, I would say that most suppliers that have a Canadian address will be able to bid on Canadian opportunities. So the goal of the Buy Canadian policy is not to exclude foreign suppliers. So the goal is to make sure that we prioritize our Canadian suppliers.
Okay. Of the contracts awarded to suppliers with Canadian addresses, how much of the value of the contracts were subcontracted outside of Canada?
I would need to confirm, to validate that information in terms of how many were subcontracted. So, because oftentimes what happens with PSPC, we don't always have visibility over the portion of the supply chain that is subcontracted.
Right, which is potentially a big issue. During the Prime Minister's announcements on Buy Canadian last fall, he affirmed it would extend to federal funding streams and infrastructure on $70 billion of additional spending. How much of that $70 billion figure is going to be Canadian-made products and services?
So, the other stream, G's and C's federal funding, so that question would be best addressed by my colleagues for TBS because we're not responsible for that portion of the Buy Canadian program.
So you don't have any idea how much will be spent on Canadian-made products and services, yet we have this very critical program, the Buy Canadian program that the Public Services and Procurement are overseeing, but you don't have that number.
Well, for total G's and C, we don't have visibility over that. The goal of the Buy Canadian policy is to drive the Canadian content of our products. So we are establishing these benchmarks as we speak. So we are gathering that information in terms of how much is spent on Canadian steel, how much is spent on Canadian content. So we are gathering that information, and you're right, that will be key as we move forward.
So what I will do is I will give you an example. The government boasted about an infrastructure project in the Spring Economic Update. Maybe you're familiar with this one. The Toronto City Line 2 expansion project, which began in 2021. They identified it was 55% Canadian content. So is the government only expecting this policy to be 50% effective on infrastructure?
Yeah, no, I'm not able to comment on that specific project. This is not under the purview of the PSPC, so that transportation project. Again, what we want to do with Buy Canadian is drive Canadian content and require suppliers to provide Canadian content in order to get more points.
How much more will be considered Canadian content that wouldn't have been without the policy?
This is really interesting. I think we're going to be seeing tangible progress. Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum making their way in federal procurement. Also outside, those products, there's a lot of, for example, when we're dealing with IT procurement, the goal is to strengthen that supply chain, and we're already starting doing that with the Buy Canadian policy.
So does a Canadian supplier have to sell a Canadian good?
Well, what we do require 25, basically an allocation of score. So depending on the procurement.
So I'm not talking about how it may or may not work in a value formula. Is it required?
It depends on the circumstances of the procurement. If, for example, we're talking about a building made of steel, we're going to be requiring Canadian steel.
Does the Canadian supplier have to include Canadian services in procurement bids? Specifically, is it a requirement?
Okay, it depends on the procurement. What we can do for certain procurement, and we're doing it right now with some of the procurement that have been issued, is basically put a minimum threshold of services, of Canadian services. So we're doing that for some procurement. What we're also doing is also allocate more points towards the degree of Canadian services
So points
provided.
and evaluation, but they don't actually
For some
have to sell a
procurement, we-
Canadian good or include Canadian services. So a Canadian supplier can be fully foreign-owned, and it doesn't have to make a Canadian good and doesn't have to provide a Canadian service. Is that
Well,
true?
If we go back to the definition of Canadian suppliers, you need much more than that. You need to drive economic value in Canada. You need to create employment. You need to have basically, if you're simply an importer of records and you add no value to the goods, Canadian value to the goods that you're reselling, you're not going to be able to meet that definition.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Danko, I understand you're up 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Very excited to discuss the Buy Canadian policy this afternoon. Before I was elected to public office, I spent 20 years in consulting engineering. I did a lot of work writing contracts and reviewing contracts for public sector bids. And one of the frustrations was always, in public sector, it's lowest bidder, and not being able to tailor those contracts to really benefit the local economy, and in this case, the national economy. So my first question is just, very broadly, if you could give us an overview of the current procurement procedures, how bids are evaluated, pre-qualification, that kind of thing, and how that will now change with the Buy Canada policy.
So in the past, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So in the past, we had different, non-price price elements when it was coming to bid evaluation. Technical requirement, of course, the cost was also a key driver. What we're doing now, we're really shifting the evaluation grid to include, and most procurement, a component that will be the Canadian content. So allocating 25% of the overall evaluation grid to the Canadian content. So if I'm a bidder and I'm providing more Canadian content, and it could be through services, it could also be through the raw material that I'm sourcing, I'm going to be able to get more points than my competitor. So this is a key change, I have to say, in terms of the way we did look at procurement in the past. We used to look at socioeconomic factor. This is another one that we are incorporating since December 16 with the Buy Canadian policy.
Thank you. And just so I'm clear, and for the public record, when bids are evaluated, that Buy Canadian component is, I think, 25% of the evaluation. So the bids will not necessarily go to the lowest bidder, but that evaluation of how much Canadian component in that bid will be part of the evaluation and the award.
Okay, and I may turn also to Levent if you want to provide a bit more context on the application of the policy.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yes, in effect, the Buy Canadian components become an element of determining best value. So, in the past, I would say evaluations were predominantly based on technical merit and financial criteria, and now we've also included elements related to Buy Canadian. Some of those elements will be mandatory as it relates to, for example, the use of materials in construction and defense contracts. So we have mandatory requirements related to steel, aluminum, and wood. And beyond that, we're looking at Canadian value added, both for the services component as well as the goods that would comprise of a solution that's being proposed.
Thank you. And the current policy right now applies to federal contracts, $25 million and over, but the plan is, the initiative is to reduce that down to $5 million and also roll out the small business procurement program. So could you elaborate on the future of the Buy Canadian policy?
For sure. So we plan to lower the threshold as of June 15. So that's going to have also a huge impact in terms of the numbers of procurement opportunity that will be covered, that will benefit from the Buy Canadian opportunities. We're going to have much more contract where we're going to be driving Canadian content. So that's one thing. And at the same time, we're also working actively on the small business procurement program. The goal is to see how can we simplify procurement? How can we make procurement more accessible to small businesses? On that point also, we can turn it to Clinton if you allow me, because he could also expand on that.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. As mentioned, one of our priorities is to make procurement more accessible for small business. And in the context of that, that new policy, which is still currently under development and looking to be released in the near future, that will have elements of simplification. So we'll be looking at how to look at the actual process of procurement itself. For example, taking it from the perspective of a small business and what they have to go through in terms of having to go through the steps. Can we streamline that, make it easier? Can we make the requirements much more clearer? So these are elements that we're going to be looking at, and also the provision of support to business, including leveraging technologies and digital technologies to ensure that the support that small business needs is accessible on a 24/7 basis.
Thank you. And there's interest across Canada in Buy Canadian for very obvious reasons. I'm coming from the municipal level. It was something that we were very interested in. I know the province of Ontario is very interested in Buy Canadian. So it is very good to see this leadership from the federal level. So my question through you, Chair, is, as the federal government is leading with Buy Canadian policies, how do we see that impacting decisions at the provincial and municipal level of government as well?
So, apologize, just a short answer, please, about 30 seconds.
Working closely with provincial territorial partners to provide them with a roadmap to implement their own version of Buy Canadian, should they wish.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks. Madame Gaudreau.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to understand. I understand that what we're trying to do is positive, but it's very different. When we're talking about build Canada homes, we want to build more housing. We want to have suppliers, Canadian suppliers. But in my riding, and it's happening elsewhere too, there are factories that are closing their doors. So if they were potential suppliers, or instead of looking to the European market, we could focus on the Canadian market. But we need to start by helping a Canadian business to survive first and foremost. Have you thought about that at all? I think that we're very concerned to see these factories, whether they are steel factories or others, that they're closing their doors. We want departmental purchases to benefit Canadian businesses. So perhaps in the past we were getting our wood elsewhere. Perhaps there were components that were imported by businesses. We want this to be mandatory in future contracts. We want it to benefit local workers. But my question's a very simple one. They have no cash flow. They can have support on the medium long term. There was a shop that closed in my riding that had been open for 100 years. Entrepreneurs are saying that you're trying to help, you want me to receive a certification, but I have to close some of the business. Is there any support? I think that, is there any support coming for these businesses? Unfortunately, that is outside of my expertise. Perhaps I could speak to this collaboration and they could give you more information on that. I wanted to flag that because it's common sense for entrepreneurs, and there are proposals that we saw during the pandemic. Businesses have come to see us and they weren't listened to, and now we're talking about buying Canadian. But anyway, if we look at Germany and France, there are public purchases that are made in order to support the industrial ecosystem. We talk about suppliers, processing, procurement. Is the Canadian government doing things in a similar way, or are policies being developed independently? I think that there are other countries that are developing their supply system, their procurement system. This is not something that has been developed in silos in Canada. It has different components, what we have in Canada, but there are other countries that are not afraid of having policies that support their local businesses first. Can you confirm that through this there will be real and frequent consultation? Because there's nothing worse for a parliamentarian having to answer questions by saying that it's somebody else's mandate and we can't respond to the question. If we're talking about EI reform, everything is impacted by these changes, but is that part of your mandate to really ensure that there's communication, that this is not a bias act? In this policy, or for this policy, we have consulted the steel industry. We've worked with thousands of suppliers. We've asked for feedback regarding this Buy Canadian policy. And so it's part of our DNA in developing this new policy. Public markets will also have components where suppliers will be requesting information. We also have a chatbot. This allows us to respond to questions on the Buy Canadian policy. So whether it be in communicating with associations or with manufacturers, we are ensuring that we are sharing information, and it's shared with departments as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So what was the Buy Canadian threshold before? You said it was lowered. So what was the percentage before?
Well, in the past, before December 16, there was no Buy Canadian at all policy. So when we started implementing the policy, the threshold was set at $25 million for all procurement that are within scope, and that threshold will be lowered to $5 million.
Why is that?
The $25 million, why it was $25 million?
Yeah, and why'd you lower it?
Well, we want to basically ensure that when we're triggering Buy Canadian, when we're encouraging Canadian supply chain, we're able to do that across a broader kind of categories of contract.
Okay, and it was said, though, that the threshold has been lowered to 25% as a requirement, right?
No, I think if I may, I think we may have a bit of, there's 25% of the total score evaluation when it comes to bid evaluation that will be allocated to Canadian content. And the threshold of the application of the policy itself has been lowered from $25 million of the contract value to $5 million starting June 15.
Okay, maybe there was just some miscommunication from that side when they said it was lowered to 25%. Because, I mean, but I will say, Minister Robertson did say they're targeting 30%. So, I mean, like, how did you guys come up with a certain percentage? Like, like, why 25%? Why not 30%? Why not 75%?
Well, the goal was to strike the right balance, and my colleague Levin spoke about best value. So we want to make sure that there's always price, always remain a component, technical specification, also other criteria that may be assessed. So 25% is significant in terms of to drive Canadian value. So it was basically the right level in terms of the Canadian content that was required. Enough to make a difference, but also ensuring that there was still room for the other evaluation criteria such as technical and price.
Okay, so I'm just going to read you a quote from Minister Robertson. Across government, it will vary. You know, we're not being rigid about this because there are many supply chains we still need to improve across the country to make sure we can supply Canadian materials at affordable rates for the infrastructure and housing that we build. That's the end of his quote there. Man, there's a lot of things I could ask questions about there. I mean, for example, across government, it will vary. So if the minister is saying it's going to vary, does that mean that some are excluded, some have a higher threshold, some have a lower threshold? What does he mean by it will vary?
So thank you for the question. I cannot speculate in terms of what the minister meant in the context of Gs and Cs. What I can assure you is that for procurement, it's basically the same policy applicable to all department, Crown Corporation, and the threshold does not change.
Okay, does that include like Department of National Defense, the Defense
That would
Investment
include-
Agency?
Indeed, that would include, Crown Corporation, and for any question regarding Gs and Cs, I think my colleague from TBS would be best fit to answer these questions.
Okay, and then he also mentioned, though, supply at affordable rates. Have you done a cost analysis on this to understand what impact this will actually have for the Canadian taxpayer as this policy gets unrolled?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the goal of the Buy Canadian policy was also to strike the right balance between making sure that we keep a level of competitiveness, that we want suppliers to bid, that price is still a factor. Same thing with technical requirement. So in terms of the analysis right now, I would say it's too early to be able to really calculate the total amounts and draw some conclusion. But this is something that we are closely monitoring. What will be the impact on price? And at the same time, though, we are still getting a lot of competition on the procurement that we're seeing.
All right, and then just briefly, you talked about how you're going to prioritize and incentivize. Are you going to incentivize, make the same incentives for every single procurement, or will there be some incentives that are more than others for various things depending on what it is? Like, will this be equal across the board, or how's that going to roll out?
Turn to my colleague Levent, if you allow me, on that question.
Certainly. Yes, thank you for the question. The policy does allow for a certain degree of flexibility. We do have some standardized approaches that we would like to use, as we discussed, evaluating the Canadian content as 25% overall. But there may be situations where we want to provide a higher incentive or a lower one, depending on the market conditions, giving the breadth and scope of the goods and services that we purchase.
And what assurances do you have to make sure that the code of ethics is followed, to make sure that there is not preferential incentive given to well-connected bidders?
Yes, the code of ethics applies regardless, so that's something that we take very seriously.
Thanks very much. Mr. Gispero.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Bank of Montreal economists estimate that a Buy Canadian policy will add roughly $10 billion to the Canadian economy, which is about 0.3% year over year. Is your department estimating similar numbers?
Chair, so we're not procurement here at PSPC. We don't do those forecasts. That would be more the Department of Finance that would be doing that. But what we're seeing from the interaction that we have with the Canadian steel producer, the various suppliers, the policy, people are welcoming the policy and clearly saying that it's starting to have an impact. I'm not able to quantify it in the same way, but we're seeing very positive feedback provided by suppliers and Canadian Association of Manufacturers.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Canadian supply chains, for example. And in an increasingly uncertain global economic environment, will the use of a Buy Canadian policy make our supply chains more resilient and less dependent on external sources?
That's really an outcome of the policy. And maybe in the past, we had suppliers doing business with the federal government, and they were not necessarily looking at whether or not they could source the raw material or the input from a Canadian source. There was no incentive to do so, and they could have decided, well, I'm going to be importing that raw material. Now there's clearly an incentive to make sure that if they want to get more points, if they want to be successful over and over again on their bids, to really make sure that they provide Canadian content and they maximize that Canadian value content. So I think by nature, the policy itself will drive Canadian supply chain, will make also the Canadian economy much more resilient. in terms of just the steel capacity. That's one factor. When it comes also to the IT industry, the digital industry, making sure that we keep this engineering capacity in Canada, that we keep also R&D. So those are all part of the component of Buy Canadian criteria that will be driving that Canadian supply chain as well as resiliency.
I'm glad you mentioned Canadian raw materials. And I'm specifically referring to, in this particular question, aluminum, steel, wood being at the forefront of our government's investment purview. Can you tell us how investment in homegrown strategic sectors such as aluminum, steel, and wood protects Canadian industries from trade shocks and strengthens our supply chains?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So when we're, especially the steel industry, this is a very capital-intensive industry, as you know. So they need to make sure, especially when they're being basically closed from other foreign markets, that they can at least leverage their domestic market, that they can still kind of keep the mill running, and that we're able at least to provide enough the supply in Canada so that they can sell. When they sell, for example, when we're buying bridges, when we're going to be doing infrastructure, when D&D is looking at defense project, that we're sourcing Canadian steel. And itself, that makes a huge difference.
Because of the significant change that the world is currently going through, and I'm trying to be diplomatic, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. How has the Buy Canadian policy insulated some of our domestic companies from that change? And you touched on it a little earlier, but if you can just expand on it.
So I would say that the way that we did design the Buy Canadian policy, we're not excluding foreign companies. So our domestic companies, if that's the sense of your question, can still be able to bid on foreign opportunities, especially those that have also a presence outside Canada. So I have to say that it's been very, very much welcomed by corporation, by Canadian suppliers. I'm not sure, Levent, if you want to add anything on that.
Sure. The only other thing I would add, in essence, is to ensure that we're fully leveraging the capacities that exist in Canada. And as the industry has more insight into the types of procurements that are upcoming and the types of things that the government is purchasing, we believe that they will also make those investments in order to fully leverage this policy going forward.
I apologize, that is our time. Okay. Madame Gaudreau, please.
Thank you, Chair. So, you've talked about preference. That's not what we want to hear. We want there to be some foreseeability. We want to hear talk about a strategy. If we don't have a long-term vision, what's going to happen? I've talked about Europe as an example, but they have long-term goals. They're not only focused on winning the next election. Are there any strategies for the Canadian economy in the long term? Is this something that you talk about? The Buy Canadian policy is part of an ecosystem. It's part of a wide range of measures. The Buy Canadian policy is showing some impacts, contracts in Quebec, for example. And so there are different criteria. Some are mandatory. When we're talking about steel, we're talking about contracts where we require the use of Canadian steel, aluminum, and wood. For the second policy, there's an allocation of points. So a supplier who is not submitting Canadian content, well, we might not prioritize that person or that company. If we're not talking about wood, aluminum, or steel, well, they would have a hard time winning the bid. A competitor will say that they would be able to bid with 50% of Canadian content. So we're seeing a real change in the private markets. Chair, I would like to be reassured. I want for everyone to be around the table. You're talking about labor, but we're talking about closing a factory and dealing with someone else. But this leads to job losses. And then there are people who will look for products abroad, and they'll talk about free trade agreements. But for the factory, there are still going to be problems. We don't need a rubber stamp here. And it's a Bloc MP saying this. It's not a purchasing preference. There needs to be an industrial strategy nationally. What do you think of that? The policy that we're implementing is a good example.
Pastor Time, if you could answer just briefly.
Ça s'applique, dans le fond, on travaille beaucoup avec nos collègues des provinces.
We work with our provincial and territorial colleagues and crown corporations, and this is really a movement that impacts hundreds of federal organizations.
Mrs. Jensen.
What is your department's definition of Canadian under this Buy Canadian policy?
Well, the definition of Canadian suppliers is basically to have a permanent establishment in Canada, to pay taxes in Canada, to create employment in Canada, or to have a place of business in Canada. So those are key criteria. So it's to drive, not only.
Thank you. Sorry, I have lots of questions. So,
Okay.
Does the policy require a Canadian head office?
The policy does
Yes
not,
or no?
does not require Canadian head office.
Could a company with a Canadian office or PO box who operates primarily outside of Canada count as Canadian? Yes or no?
In all likelihood, they're going to be excluded.
Can a company that's 100% foreign owned still qualify as Canadian?
They could.
Could a foreign company create a Canadian subsidiary and qualify as Canadian?
If they meet the other aspect of the Canadian supplier definition, yes.
Okay, so if a company from a country without a trade agreement with Canada establishes a Canadian subsidiary, registers and files taxes here, maintains a Canadian address, and conducts day-to-day business here, could it qualify as a Canadian supplier?
If they have enough employment in Canada, then they drive Canadian content, they're going to be able to qualify.
Okay. Does PSPC distinguish between Canadian-owned companies and foreign-owned companies operating in Canada?
That was a policy decision that was made in order not
Is
to
that a yes or
penalize
no?
Canadian.
Is that yes?
We don't.
You don't. That's a no.
That's a no.
Does your department track how many procurement go to foreign-owned firms qualifying as Canadian?
Yes, we are tracking this.
Okay, so when the policy refers to Canadian services or Canadian labor, does that mean labor performed by Canadian citizens and permanent residents, or simply work performed by individuals based in Canada?
I may turn to Levent on that specific question, if you allow me.
It generally has to do with the people performing the work and if they reside in Canada. So they're Canadian citizens or otherwise lawfully here, like immigrants. Yeah.
So temporary foreign workers, it includes that then?
I wouldn't get into that myself personally because I don't know the exact legal construct on that.
How does PSPC verify where the actual work is performed?
This is done through self-attestations, and we do have the ability to audit those attestations as well, and we are also developing a compliance framework as well.
Does the policy apply only to the prime contractor?
The policy flows from the prime contractor to other levels as well. So when we're talking about Canadian content, those would be things that are applicable throughout the supply chain.
So your policy will apply to subcontractors as well?
Well, it applies to subcontractors in the sense that we will be looking at where those goods are produced or the services are rendered to determine the Canadian content.
So how many levels down the subcontracting chain does it apply?
It would depend on the circumstance, depending on the levels of
What percentage of value-added work can be subcontracted outside of Canada before a supplier no longer qualifies as Canadian?
In terms of the value of the subcontracting, we are not putting a hard limit on that. That's more determined based on the evaluation. So the more Canadian content you have, the higher points you will get.
Okay. I have another question, sorry. Has PSPC defined the threshold in writing? What we were just talking about.
So the threshold in terms of, you could be disqualified as a Canadian suppliers if most of your activities we realize that you're subcontracting. So you're no longer driving those Canadian activities. For example, the suppliers has this kind of outsourcing 75%.
Is it in writing?
It's basically as part of the policy, and it's going to define.
So it's in writing, we could find that?
Yeah, you could find that
if
as
you
part.
could hand that in, that would be great. That would be wonderful.
There's no specific threshold, though.
So who verifies subcontractor compliance?
Basically, in terms of the subcontractor compliance, it's going to be on the supply chain. So it's going to be incumbent on the main contractor to ensure that his subcontractor are keeping all the evidence required to the self-attestation.
How many resources will it take to properly monitor compliance?
We are basically launching the policy. So there's a group. So primarily, we're going to be relying on self-attestation.
Okay. Okay. In any procurement so far, has the government paid more in order to meet Buy Canadian requirements?
I'm not able to comment on that. We had limited numbers of procurements so far
Okay.
that have been
And has PSPC calculated the average cost premium associated with applying this policy?
We have nine contracts that have been awarded, so we don't have a large sample that will allow us to be able to calculate that at this time.
Do you have a formal audit framework for Buy Canadian compliance?
We do have a compliance framework that has been developed, so we did involve our audit group as part of that. And yes, it's a very comprehensive, detailed audit. and
Except
compliance
it's
framework.
a lot of it is self-attestation, is what I
No,
understood
well,
from
there's
your
much more.
answers.
It starts with a self-attestation, but at any time we can request information.
Will audits be random or risk-based?
It's going to be risk-based.
And will they rotate
I
between?
apologize. That is our time. Thanks very much. We'll finish with Ms. Rochefort, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
Questioning as my colleague, Madame Jansen, if I may. And so if you would answer with a yes or a no, or maybe just a very short reply, if that's appropriate. This policy gives a clear and measurable advantage to companies with a real footprint in Canada, businesses that invest here, employ Canadians, and contribute to local economies. Yes or no, or a very short answer?
No, yes, it really drives. The goal is to become our best customers when we procure, when we buy as a government, and leading by example on that front. Yes.
Thank you. Second question. Federal procurements will prioritize bids that feature greater Canadian content, which includes manufacturing, research and development, and other economic activities that occur domestically. A yes or a no, or a very short answer?
Yes, and the more Canadian content you provide, the more likely you're going to be the successful bidder.
Thank you. This updated definition of Canadian suppliers adds specificity to our procurement criteria and is designed to ensure that Canadian-based companies, Canadian workforces, and Canadian industries are prioritized for investment and growth. And yes or no, maybe you could expand on that. There's a vision there.
Yes, we want, because in the past, under the Canadian suppliers definition, the only thing that you needed was a mailbox in order to be able to receive government contracts. So what we wanted to do is take the Canada Free Trade Agreement definition and add a layer to it of Canadian presence, Canadian employment. So this is what has been done to ensure that those who are going to be benefiting from the Buy Canadian are businesses that are keeping employees, that are creating jobs in Canada, and that are also paying taxes in Canada.
Thank you. This approach will strengthen our supply chains, as my colleague asked a moment ago, create good jobs across the country, diversify our economy, and ensure that federal investment benefit Canadian industries and workers, even when foreign suppliers are involved. Yes or no, and maybe a comment on foreign suppliers that are involved in our country.
Yes, and the goal is not to prevent foreign suppliers from bidding on Canadian opportunity. The Buy Canadian opportunities, it's not to exclude our trading partners. If they, for example, if they have a corporation in Canada, they're going to be able to bid. So the goal is really to incentivize Canadian content.
So why is it so important that we ensure that foreign suppliers can also bid on our contracts? What would be the impact of that, and why is that essential?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So that's an excellent question. In terms of what we want to make sure is that we have very successful companies in Canada that are doing business outside Canada, and they are bidding on opportunities at the state level, at the federal level in the U.S. and Europe, across the world. So they don't want to be cut off of the market. They do expect reciprocal treatment. So if we were to drill down on ownership, we would be putting at risk the ability of these businesses to be successful in foreign market.
Do you find alignment with the policy that Canada is coming forward with in terms of how it compares to other countries? I read the Buy American policy, and so how would you define our policy vis-a-vis those?
I'm not an expert in trade law, so I wouldn't want to draw a comparison, but I have to say that a lot of jurisdictions around the world are taking measures that are similar in nature to the Buy Canadian measure.
At this point, has the policy been rolled out across the different departments in the government?
Yes, it's been rolled out. There was a lot, and I can maybe turn it to Clinton, if you want to talk about some of the efforts that were done, if you allow me.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. As part of our implementation for the Buy Canadian initiative, we have been engaging with other departments to ensure that their readiness is progressing as it's been implemented. For example, we have a key forum that we use to engage at the buyer level across departments called the client advisory board, and so we've gone to this board a number of times, providing updates as the policies have been evolving, and we're able to answer questions and raise awareness in terms of what is coming, so that as we're gearing up to advance different steps related to the Buy Canadian initiative, our colleagues in the departments are also going to be ready. But obviously, there's still quite a lot of work to be done. But we try to make sure that Constellation is a part of it. Thank you.
Well, quick question, and you know how many dollars that represents so far this with the implementation that has occurred?
I wouldn't be able to put a value on that, but this is I would say in a sense that these are procurement responsibilities that are ongoing, and this is an added element that they need to take into consideration with respect to procurements that would likely continue. It's just the nature of how those procurements are taking place.
Merci.
Thanks very much. We're going to suspend for a few minutes and get our next witnesses in. Thanks for being with us again, and we'll probably see you back maybe for supplementary A's. We're suspended for a few moments. Welcome back our colleagues, I guess, from Treasury Board. Opening statement, Mr. Crumans, is wonderful. Floor is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. My name is Martin Crumans, Assistant Controller General for the Financial Management Sector at Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat. I'm here today with my colleagues, Michelle Keeley, Acting Executive Director for Financial Management and Transfer Payments, and Emilio Franco, Executive Director of Procurement and Material Directorate. We are pleased to be here to speak about grants and contributions and our work supporting the implementation of the Buy Canadian policy. At the Office of the Controller General, we provide government-wide direction in areas such as financial management, internal audit, investment planning, procurement, project management, as well as management of real property, material, and transfer payments, also known as grants and contributions. Grants and contributions are governed by the Treasury Board policy on transfer payments, which sets out roles and responsibilities and requirements for their management. The objective is to ensure these programs respond to government priorities, deliver results for Canadians, and are managed with integrity, transparency, and accountability. Control mechanisms are in place throughout the process. Departments must first obtain policy approval for programs and then seek Treasury Board approval for terms and conditions. These terms and conditions establish the parameters for transfer payments, including objectives, funding, expected results, and eligibility criteria. En ce qui concerne les rôles et responsabilités, les ministères sont responsables.
In terms of roles and responsibilities, departments are responsible for the design and delivery of their grants and contributions programs, ensuring to establish appropriate practices and requirements are proportionate to risk. They are also responsible for monitoring compliance and performance through reporting to ensure programs achieve their intended results.
So the Controller General supports the management of grants and contributions by ensuring that terms and conditions align with Cabinet direction and the policy on transfer payments. The OCG plays a government-wide leadership role and oversight by promoting sound management practices, monitoring compliance, and supporting the transfer payments community. Let me now turn to the Buy Canadian policy and our role in supporting its implementation in grants and contributions. I understand you spoke with PSPC earlier, but in terms of our roles, PSPC is responsible for developing and implementing the Buy Canadian procurement policy framework, while TBS supports extending this policy to grants and contributions through guidance, awareness, and alignment with the pre-existing Treasury Board instruments. By extending the policy to grants and contributions, federal funding programs can encourage recipients to prioritize and support Canadian content and suppliers where it aligns with program objectives and authorities. To date, the Treasury Board Secretariat has taken a pragmatic approach by developing guidance to help departments determine where and how to integrate Buy Canadian considerations. This guidance aims to ensure a consistent approach while maintaining a degree of flexibility. Departments have also reviewed their programs to identify where Buy Canadian considerations can be applied. Implementation is progressing through the integration of Buy Canadian related provisions into new funding agreements and, where appropriate, revisiting or renegotiating existing agreements. Going forward, the focus will be on ensuring that funding conditions are respected, using existing oversight mechanisms while minimizing additional burden and complexity. In closing, Mr. Chair, the Office of the Controller General continues to work closely with departments to ensure that grants and contribution programs are well managed, effective, and aligned with broader federal objectives, including the implementation of this policy. Monsieur le Président, nous serions maintenant
We
heureux.
would be pleased to answer any questions you may have. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We'll start with Dr. Lewis. You have 6 minutes. Welcome to OGO.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Canadians were told that federal infrastructure spending would support Canadian workers, Canadian industries, especially during the rough periods of tariffs and economic uncertainty. Yet documents that were tabled in Parliament through an order paper question shows billions flowing to projects that depend on foreign suppliers, including foreign telecommunications equipment, and even $1 billion being focused on a foreign shipyard. So can the government explain why, despite Buy Canada announcements, responses provided to Parliament by way of the order paper questions indicated that there's no contract that has been signed within a clear Buy Canada framework.
Thank you for your question. I'm unable to speak to the components of contracting, but with respect to grants and contributions, I can say that we are at the first phase of our implementation, where we have now directed all departments to assess their programs, which are approximately 800 programs across the Government of Canada that represent about $90 billion in annual spending.
In that assessment, do you plan to track the percentage of Canadian labor, Canadian materials, Canadian ownership, participation that is attached to federally financed infrastructure projects? Is that something that you do now? And if you don't, do you plan to do that in the future?
Yes, thank you for your question. So with respect to how we're going to be tracking and implementing this, as I said, there are about 700 to 800 programs across the Government of Canada. We directed all departments to undertake that assessment. That assessment was completed in the middle of February. Ministers and departments came back acknowledging that about 450 of those programs would be in scope and eligible and be incorporating Buy Canada principles into their programs.
Okay, what are Buy Canada principles? How do you define Buy Canada principles? How can the government verify that Canadian workers are actually benefiting from these taxpayer finance, say, for example, infrastructure projects?
Yeah, so with respect to infrastructure projects, the Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada has published their specific guidance and framework on how they're going to be implementing in that realm. But with respect to all of Government of Canada, what we have done is encourage departments to incorporate the definitions and thresholds and requirements, including eligibility criteria.
You use the word encourage, so yes. You don't require them to do that. You said encouraged.
Well, so there are several ways in which the policy can be incorporated into a program. It can be incorporated by amending the program's terms and conditions. It can be incorporated by changing the eligibility projects up front.
So this is not a requirement. The Buy Canada is not a requirement of projects then, is that correct?
No, sorry. I may have misspoke. So the policy is mandatory on all grants and contributions programs, and we have asked and instructed departments to assess their programs for where they may be most appropriate, where there may be not applicable, and where they may require an exception. And
how many projects across the government contain mandatory Canadian content requirements as opposed to voluntary? Do you know that answer?
We're not at that stage yet. So the first stage where we're at is we have instructed all departments to assess their programs on incorporating and identify which programs will incorporate and which programs would not be a proper candidate for the Buy Canada programming.
And since 2017, do you know how many programs or foreign suppliers or foreign state-like firms have benefited from funding programs that are basically that would have the Buy Canada attached to it in the future?
With apologies, I do not have that information.
Okay. So we don't know what we're trying to fix. Is that what you're telling me?
Thank you for the question. No, I think what I would say in this case is that we're promoting the Buy Canada policy through the grants and contributions instruments.
So do you track the economic benefits arising from these projects then? So what's your measure?
Mm-hmm. So within the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, we don't track that centrally. These are components of program results that are reported within each department. And so from a central perspective, we are encouraging four types of indicators to measure results in this program. First
you realize that this sounds like a slogan. It's
no.
Buy Canada sounds like a slogan because you're expecting Canadians to trust you when you're not tracking outcomes. And so what is your measure? How could Canadians be convinced that taxpayer dollars are going to be used to help fund Canadian jobs, Canadian labor, Canadian manufacturing, and Canadians are going to benefit ahead of foreign companies? How can you trust that when you're not measuring it?
So thank you for your question. The guidance that we have issued to department actually prescribes four specific measures that we would I'd like to see them be tracking. First is the number and value of funding agreements prioritizing Canadian materials. The second is the number and value of funding agreements prioritizing Canadian content.
Yeah, you've already highlighted that. So I just want to know, do you have a capability of enforcing those things that you're saying that you're tracking? What's your enforcement procurement mechanism that you're going to use?
Just, we have no time. If it's a brief answer, go ahead. If not, we'll get back to it in the
So the
next
plan
round.
for the Treasury Board of Canada Secretary to monitor compliance is through the risk and compliance process. That's an annual piece driven out of the Treasury Board Secretariat.
Thank you very much. Mr. Guismero, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for being here. We recently announced our first Buy Canadian project with the acquisition of 55 new subway trains for Toronto's Line 2 subway. The project has over 55% Canadian content and will fund more than 900 direct jobs and 1,700 indirect jobs across our country. Can you speak to how the Buy Canadian policy helped enable this purchase and how Treasury Board is working to replicate similar successes across other major projects?
Certainly, and thank you for your question. As I was saying, that we are in the first phase of launching the Buy Canadian policy and integration into the grants and contributions programming. That first phase was launched in December 16th and required departments to assess their grant and contributions to identify where those policies can be applied. The second phase, which was actually completed in February 16th recently, focused on departments determining how to integrate those requirements into their program design. And so, for example, the Buy Canadian policy requirements are embedded either in terms and conditions, in funding agreements, or recipient reporting as appropriate. So right now, the departments are currently in the phase 3, and the example that you provided would be a very good example of that, which involves implementation occurring in 2 streams, incorporating Buy Canadian related provisions into new agreements that are signed, and where appropriate into existing agreements as they are visited or negotiated. And so we're seeing this across a multitude of strategic sectors. So the example that you have provided is within the infrastructure, construction, and transportation sector. That's the largest contributor to the Buy Canadian policy. From the assessments that departments have completed. Health and pharmaceuticals is also another significant one, along with communications and defense and security.
Thank you for that. Just moving on to something else quite quickly, and I think you touched on it a little earlier. Can you walk us through what are the plans to monitor the Buy Canadian policy to ensure it's functioning as intended?
Thank you for your question. So we have 3 strategies that we're going to be implementing to monitor compliance to the policy for grants and contributions. The first is we're going to be using the risk and compliance process, which is an annual process managed through the Treasury Board Secretariat. It involves all departments assessing their compliance to these policies. And we will be asking 2 specific questions: the percentage of agreements that were signed as identified against their earlier assessments, and the percentage of agreements and the values that will be obtained through that. The second one is we're asking departments to track through annual departmental reporting and identifying their best practices and lessons learned and updating their tools and resources accordingly. And so, as I've noted, we prescribed some specific performance measures, including the value and number of agreements. And this is below the program level. So the statistics in terms of the number of programs that are incorporating Buy Canadian policy, that's at the program level. We will be asking departments to start tracking that at the very specific agreement level and project level, as well as including value of materials and value of Canadian content. I would caution, though, given the magnitude of projects that are in scope, we're estimating roughly 45,000 projects funded annually would be within scope. And so it is quite an overwhelming paper burden to go through all those. So our systems will need to catch up. But rest assured, these are the measures that we're trying to track.
Can you touch on some of the exceptions to
Absolutely.
the Buy Canadian policy and explain the rationale behind them, please?
For that, I'll turn to my colleague, Michelle Keeley.
Thank you very much for your question. So naturally, given the diverse nature of grants and contributions programs, we've allowed for exceptions. As we've indicated in our guidance, the departments are to identify where applying Buy Canadian would not make sense. So for example, where there's programs where the funding has already been subscribed, that wouldn't make sense, and also for programs that have sunsetted. So in the case where it would naturally apply, but it's not the circumstance that would allow for it, again, the minister would approve that exception.
Right. How much time do I have, Chair?
A minute 50.
Great, thank you. It was touched on earlier that there was a reduction in the threshold with contracts from, I guess, high water mark of $25 million down to contracts worth $5 million. Can you touch on the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so grants and contributions are a bit of a different instrument from procurement. And so procurement is a very prescriptive set of rules. Grants and contributions are an instrument where we provide funding to a recipient to further objectives of the Government of Canada. This is not a case where we're acquiring specifically a good or service in return. And so we're contributing and providing money to a project's ultimate outcomes. And so with respect to thresholds, because of the diversity of programs across the Government of Canada, specifically infrastructure or health, or working with small NGOs who provide local community services, we did not set out a threshold or definitions within the construct of the guidance for grants and contributions. Rather, what we do is we point directly to the definitions and thresholds that are contained within the PSPC framework for Buy Canadian. That said, in the assessments that came back, most of the departments are including at the program level eligibility criteria in programs that are well below the $5 million threshold. And so we can actually say that, if you permit me here, there are 21 departments, 116 programs that are extending the criteria to programs below the $5 million threshold. And so that, just because of the nature of their small amount, that will extend the programming by a further $185 million in total annual funding.
Great. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Madame Gaudreau.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm trying to understand and I would like to come back to questions. PSPC talked about procurement, finance talked about investment, but my question is, who is responsible for all of these policies to ensure that we're all seeking to meet the same goals? Do you sit around the same table? Thank you for the question.
In TBS is really to focus on the instruments, making sure that they're applied correctly. We are not the holders of the Buy Canadian policy, but we do work closely with Procurement and Services Canada with respect to the procurement component. And if you'd like, I could turn to Emilio Franco, my colleague, to speak about how we work with PSPC.
Peut-être je dirais qu'il y a plusieurs stratégies.
There are many strategies that have been announced by the government. Buy Canadian is part of other strategies. We have the industrial defense strategy, which goes beyond procurement, but also speaks to how we are going to strengthen Canada's economy and its defense. There are strategies whereby we work with different ministers on policies, on strategies and programs. We work together to ensure that we achieve the goal of strengthening the Canadian economy. I know that in speaking with the different departments, it might seem that we're only focused on our own policies, but we do work with other departments. I understand that you meet with the the industry community, but they have requests and they're not being heard. And so you'll end up saying that you spoke about preferences instead of an obligation, and it would be best to help everyone out. And would that be part of your to-do list, to have strategic meetings for innovation? We are always seeking to find improvements. Procurement is one tool in the toolkit to help Canadian suppliers. We have grants and contributions. We have different programs. We want to ensure that all of the programs work together, that we communicate to ensure that our strategies lead to results. We want procurement to be part of the strategy, and we want to work together to improve the Canadian economy for Canadian suppliers. If we speak about strategic sectors, has the government identified any sectors that would require more attention? In the Buy Canadian policy, there is a list of strategic sectors where the policy would apply. What about the provinces? How will Treasury Board be working with the provinces? It's not always easy to have agreements with the provinces, and so have you focused on developing such agreements? And where are you at with the provinces? For procurement, as PSPC stated earlier, they are working with provinces and territories, and we participate in these discussions as Treasury Board. We want to develop a plan that would allow us to work together. Well, the provinces have their own strategies as well. Quebec's strategy is very different from BC and Alberta. We've worked with the provinces and territories to see what would define a Canadian provider. I know that the provinces and territories are going to make their own decisions, so they won't have the same definitions, but we are trying to have a definition. I only have 20 seconds. When we look at France and Germany, they have a continuum of research with businesses, procurement contracts. Is that something that we would like to have here in Canada, yes or no? The government's strategy is to offer support for the Canadian economy. That's what it is. Thank you, Chair.
Please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome here. When Mr. Matthews last appeared here, which was on the 7th, I had asked him about the Buy Canadian policy being applied to grants and contributions programs, and we've already talked a little bit about that, and whether or not all departments would be expected to implement it. And he said, and I quote, "All departments are expected to take a look and see what might be possible." However, I would note in an announcement that was made by the Prime Minister on September 5th of last year, where he said the policy would expand to grants and contributions. And then again in the government's spring economic update, it states, and I quote, "It extends across the federal government and across all funding streams, including grants and contributions." So, which is it? Does it apply where it's possible? Does it apply to some and not others? Or will it apply to all grants and contributions?
Thank you for your question. So the policy applies to all grants and contributions, and we required ministers to assess all their programs for eligibility against this against this new policy. And so that phase has been completed, and ministers have completed and looked at how best they could incorporate those requirements into their existing programs. As noted before, there are some programs that would not be applicable. For example, where a grant and contribution is providing a benefit directly to an individual, that would obviously not be in the spirit of Buy Canada. Also, there are some international payments that we make for treaty obligations. Those would also be excluded. And so those would be considered things that are not applicable. We have also asked departments to assess their programs, and they've also identified areas that are excluded from the Buy Canada provisions. And those would be programs that programs where the agreements are already fully subscribed, so there are no new funding opportunities, or where the funding is sunsetting, so there was money in previous years but no longer going forward, although they're on the books. So that assessment has been completed.
So is it possible to integrate the policy into grants at all, or just contributions, knowing the difference between the two?
The grants are certainly an item that can be considered to have Buy Canada as part of their design, and that would be through their upfront eligibility. So in order to be eligible for a specific grant, a department could choose to write in eligibility requirements that align with the Buy Canada definitions.
So given that a grant is not subject to being accounted for by a recipient, nor normally subject to audit by the department, what's the plan to audit or monitor compliance of grants if, according to the Treasury Board's policy on transfer payments, grants cannot be audited?
Yeah, so before I'll turn over to Michelle, but the grants will be part of our reporting through the risk and compliance process. But Michelle, did you want to add a little bit more?
Yep, no problem. So based on the policy, a department can take a decision based on risk to include additional provisions for results reporting. So in that instance, a department, given the interest of Buy Canadian, may indicate reporting requirements.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So have you set a timeline for departments to advise the Treasury Board or PSPC when they can or can't implement this policy into their grants and contributions program?
Yeah, so we required those assessments to be provided to the Treasury Board Secretariat by February 16th, and all departments had submitted those assessments to us. So we are now, we essentially now know which programs are intending to move forward with changes to their programs to incorporate that.
So I thank you for the explanation you've provided to me between the difference between what has been stated by Mr. Matthews and then the pretty definitive expectation that's been laid out by the Prime Minister's office and then in the official government communication document in the SCU. It would appear, though, that they're claiming something that actually isn't true by saying that this will be extended to all grants and contributions and funding streams. So I just want to note that there's inconsistency there. My final question would be, can you tell me more about the ministerial exceptions being provided under this policy? I think, Ms. Keeley, you had referenced the exemptions or exceptions that ministers would have.
So as
I have to interrupt. They're a very quick question, and you'll have to get back to us in writing.
We can do that as a follow-up.
Yes,
No
get
problem.
back to us in writing, please.
Thanks. Mr. Danko, please.
Thank you, Chair. And again, I think Canadians are very supportive of Buy Canadian policy in this moment for various obvious reasons. Canadians are expecting the federal government to support Canadian business, Canadian workers first and foremost. So I'm very happy that our government is taking this leadership role at the federal level to implement this policy and expecting that provincial governments, municipalities, and other partners will also follow suit. So, we're really setting the expectation nationally for what Buy Canadian means. So my understanding is that from the federal perspective, there's two ways in which this policy applies. The first is through direct federal procurement, and we heard about that earlier through Public Works and Government Services, but also through federal funding. So when we're funding projects through grants, contributions, loans, and other funding agreements. So just to go back to kind of first principles, what are those funding mechanisms? Who receives that funding? How are those agreements arranged? Just a broader definition of what grants, contributions, loans, what is that category?
Answer that question.
No problem. Grants and contribution programs, by their very nature, those are funding programs that support a project that's led by the recipient. And so just to give you a sense of the magnitude, the policy on transfer payments covers $82 billion over 700 programs. So the diversity of the G's and C's is quite unique. I think the intent with the Canadian Buy Canadian policy is, again, to consider extending it. It's a real opportunity to look at broader impacts. In terms of the grants and contributions process, you've got departmental programs. When they get their annual appropriation. And when they want to put a project in place, they'll launch a call for proposals, receive applications. In the context of Buy Canadian, they may put some Buy Canadian provisions in the application stage. They might consider putting it at the assessment stage, including some provisions within the funding agreement. But once the funding is flowed through the funding agreement, there's standard monitoring and reporting procedures that are to be followed as per the policy.
Thank you. So it would be part of the terms and conditions of the transfer payments. I think you said that earlier. The Buy Canadian policy requirements are mandatory. I think we've clarified that. So I'll use an example. A municipal wastewater treatment plant, 30% federal funding, 30% provincial funding, 30% municipal. The federal component of that would be subject to the federal Buy Canadian policy that we're talking about, and that would be written into the transfer agreement with, the proponent of that project. And our further expectation would be that the provincial and municipal contributors would also have a similar policy following suit. So could you maybe help me to understand how that would work in an example like that?
I can start if you'd like. So as per the guidance, we've asked for departments when they're doing their assessment, if they have projects that support provincial federal funding, that if there is a provincial Buy Canadian policy in place, and if it aligns to the federal approach, that be considered. And so in that case where you've got distribution across all the jurisdictions, the expectation is that they would align. So it would be worked at the funding agreement level to make sure that they speak to each other and that they work in the context of the recipient and the success of the project.
Thank you. And can you also help me to understand specifically when we are making these project awards, or I'm not sure what the right word is, announcements, that all the proponents are aware of what the Buy Canadian requirements are, that they're participating in? I heard some concern earlier about tracking and monitoring, in particular about grants, but just from the initial stage, when that transfer or that funding agreement is approved, what requirements, tracking, reporting is included to make sure that the proponent is actually following through with the requirements that we are setting forth?
Departments are encouraged at the beginning of a funding agreement when it's being drafted to talk about monitoring requirements. And so the expectation is that they would put in provisions in the funding agreement that would outline clearly the data that was expected as part of the project.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau.
Je voudrais revenir sur ma
I would like to come back to my long-term vision. I'm an entrepreneur, and we work with risk management. If you don't look to the medium and long term, why would I make any effort, even if this could have a direct impact? If we're talking about purchasing, and if the government changes tomorrow, this is not a long-term vision like they have in France and Germany. I've asked this question a few times. This is a purchasing policy, procurement policy. It's not focused on industrial prosperity, if I've understood correctly. It's a policy, a procurement policy that's extended to grants and contributions. It's a government policy. There are different policies. For example, the Industrial Defense Strategy and a strategy that was announced in the economic statement. I asked the question to PSPC not too long ago. I asked them how they saw IT. There are countries that have decided to really take charge. And the Premier in Quebec is working on an alliance for development with France regarding the digital ecosystem. Here we've only talked about the cost of no longer using Microsoft. And when I ask whether or not IBM is Canadian, I'm told yes. We're going to have to look at the definition of what's Canadian. And so it's not very reassuring. You're saying that it's a policy, but we need to see everything as a whole. And my question was, who is responsible for all of this to ensure a long-term vision and not a vision only to seek re-election? That's an interesting question. In the context of procurement, there's the buyer and the procurement agent. PSPC is the procurement agent. They apply the policy for procurement. The buyer is the one who defines the need. If the buyer defines the need and that they will go for a multinational provider, well, procurement will follow suit. But if the buyer defines their needs and Canadian suppliers are able to respond, and we could look at the regional response, well then we might be able to reach that long-term vision that you mentioned. Treasury Board focuses on certain things. PSPC looks at these procurement agents. We focus on departments and see how they can define their needs and how they can direct procurement in a way that would be better for Canadian suppliers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At the start of the meeting, you referenced that you have given guidance to the departments. Just wondering if you could table that guidance with the committee. Thank you. There's been some updates to the policy, talking about how you're getting provinces and territories on board with a Buy Canadian policy. Has everybody agreed to a 25% Canadian content or policy directive? That 25%, is that agreed upon between federal, provincial, and municipal governments?
So as it applies to the grants and contribution, we do not have that type of requirement. That's not, we do not put those definitions into our guidance. We allow each department to work with the recipients and their provincial counterparts to determine what might be appropriate for Buy Canada.
Okay, so if one, let's say a province came up with a 50% threshold, whose threshold supersedes, the province or the feds?
It would really depend on the objectives of that program, but in the relationships and the projects that we're taking collaboratively with the provincial counterparts, we would consider the provincial regime acceptable as long as it's reasonable and considered balanced with what we're trying to achieve.
All right. The Department of Agriculture, in an internal memo, said it would only comply if it did not cost extra time or money and it was in the public interest. Given that you guys are support extending the policy to all the various departments, what are your thoughts on how the Department of Agriculture views this? Because it sounds to them as if it's optional, and that they'll do it only if it makes sense.
Oh, yeah. So thank you for your question. With respect to the Department of Agriculture's memo, I think we've worked with them since December to make sure that they're applying the guidance that we've prescribed. And so I don't know with respect to those requirements, if that's on the procurement side, on the grants and contributions side. But with respect to the grants and contributions side, certainly the cost and value for money is a factor in assessing how far to apply the Buy Canadian policy. So they need to consider the cost considerations as they apply it to their projects.
If I'm able to add just very quickly, the exceptions that you highlighted are actually the exceptions that are ingrained in the PSPC policy itself. The best value, public interest, no capacity, undue delay. These are all prescribed exceptions that exist in PSPC's policy. And application of them, of course, are in that policy subject to the minister. So without having the specific memo in front of me, I would expect that agriculture was simply speaking to the existing exceptions that are outlined under the policy.
Subject to the minister, which minister?
So the PSPC's policy does speak to which minister has to approve those exceptions. So in the case of a procurement that's within a department's jurisdiction, it's that department's minister. If it's a procurement that comes to PSPC, it's both the minister of that department and the minister of PSPC.
Does the minister responsible for PSPC have a veto over the other ministers if that minister decides that they don't agree?
I expect we would have a discussion and sort that out.
Okay. I guess we'll find out maybe if that happens. What enforcement mechanism does Treasury Board have for the Buy Canadian policy? Like we've been hearing a lot about, it's kind of self-reporting. It just feels kind of loosey-goosey about the requirements. So what enforcement metric do you have to make sure that this 25% or just whatever metric is agreed to isn't abused?
Yeah, so we will be using the risk and compliance process, which is annually. It requires departmental deputy heads to provide attestations on where they're at on the compliance. So we will be monitoring and checking through a formula-based approach. We're going to look at what they said in their assessment and comparing it to actual results in the fall.
Okay, so it's all retroactive then?
Apologies, I don't understand.
So, okay, so I'm Canadian, I get the contract, finds out later that I'm not Canadian. That's retroactive.
Yeah. So there is a component of recipient audit as well. And so maybe, Michelle, can you speak a little bit about the recipient audit process?
Yeah, the departments, sorry, are we done? Just that departments are responsible for doing risk-based recipient audits. So the expectation is they would include some Buy Canadian related projects to ensure that they're meeting the expectations of the funding agreement.
Does every department have extra budget capacity to be able to do these audits?
Extra budget capacity? They would be expected to work within their existing resource levels for departmental audits.
And do they have the resources specific to be able to do it?
I would say in that case, each department has an internal audit shop and a chief financial officer that is able to exercise those requirements.
Thanks very much. Is it the deputy minister or the CFO that's overseeing those audits, though? I thought it was the deputy minister.
So ultimately, the deputy minister is responsible for the management of the department, but the chief financial officer executes those recipient audits on his behalf.
Well, we'll finish with Mr. Osborne. Welcome back, Mr. Osborne.
Always a pleasure to be at OGO. I know you've touched on it, but I wonder if you can elaborate on the role of Treasury Board versus the role of departments in putting in place these policies.
Absolutely. And so, as we highlighted in our opening remarks, and as PSPC mentioned earlier, the Buy Canadian policy is a PSPC policy, a Public Service Procurement Canada policy, and Treasury Board's Secretariat's role is complementary to that. So we've been working with PSPC to support implementation across government, extending it to grants and contributions, providing strategic direction, and aligning with our own policy instruments. So Treasury Board's directive on the management of procurement, our procurement policy, was amended December 16th to reflect the importance of incorporating economic interests into procurement. We also had an important role in extending the Buy Canadian policy to Crown corporations. The Buy Canadian policy is very unique in that it is the first procurement policy of the government that actually extends all the way down to Crown corporations, and that required some work. Because our policy doesn't apply to Crown corporations. So we actually had to issue order in councils to the respective responsible departmental portfolio ministers to require the extension of the Buy Canadian policy to Crown corporations. And so that was a role that we played in coordinating that function. As well, of course, we do receive Treasury Board submissions, whether procurement or grants contributions, and we do, as part of that process, we do consider the application of Buy Canadian on those submissions when we provide our advice to Treasury Board.
Thank you. Under what you've just outlined, can you talk about how you will inform key design components when it comes to the advice and guidance that you provide to departments and to Crown Corps?
So when it comes to departments, typically Treasury Board only plays a role in the highest, the most complex procurements. And grants contributions, I'll let my colleagues speak to that in just a moment. On those procurements that come in, we of course will ask the questions of how is Buy Canadian applied, what are the benefits to the Canadian economy, what's Canadian, is there any Canadian employment resulting from this procurement? So we will ask those questions as part of our challenge function to make sure that departments have considered these, not just the application of Buy Canadian, but also in the story, what are the benefits resulting from the application of Buy Canadian policy in the context of this specific procurement? In terms of our guidance in advance of anything coming to Treasury Board, we do work with departments and we'll be providing advice to them on how to consider and think about Canadian influence to define requirements in a manner that supports Canadian interests. So I gave an example to the member earlier, but another example is when you're designing a building, procurement will procure whatever the architect says you need to build, but if you ask the architect, can you architect this building in a way that will use Canadian steel, in a way that will use Canadian lumber? Now, all of a sudden, not only is the procurement, yes, we'll run Buy Canadian as an outcome, but from the very beginning, from the design, we'll support higher likelihood of Canadian inputs into that, where if that thought wasn't there at the beginning, likely wouldn't result in the same kind of outcome. So part of our role will be working with managers across government to help them understand how to think early on about how to incorporate a Canadian into the design. I don't know if my colleague wants to speak on the G&C side.
Go ahead, Michelle.
So in the context of new programming for grants and contributions, they would come to Treasury Board for approval. We would look as owning the policy on transfer payments. We would review the submission, specifically the terms and conditions. In the case where they would touch on part of the 5 strategic industries, it's a natural question that we would ask our departmental colleagues, have you considered Buy Canadian? And so that's been an iterative process where they would include that in most circumstances. And I had indicated before it could be specific eligibility criteria identified in the terms and conditions, or they could decide that they would simply identify specific provisions that would play out through the funding agreements.
You sort of touched on my next question, but can you outline what the framework and supporting instruments will look like when it comes to departments in terms of grants and contributions, and whether or not that differs from the framework and supporting instruments for Crown Corps?
I'm afraid that's our time, but we're going to add one more 3-minute round for each and then a 2-minute for the block. So perhaps we can answer in that time, Mr. Osborne. We'll go to you, Madame Gaudreau, for 2 minutes, and then Mrs. Block, and then back to the Liberals.
Oui, merci.
Or Mrs. Jansen.
Quelle sera la reddition de comptes?
How will you ensure accountability? How will parliamentarians be able to ensure that small businesses don't fall through the cracks? Will you keep us informed? Because I get the impression that it's a real work in progress, that the first step is done, but it's still ongoing. So how can you guarantee that we will be kept informed and ensure that it is beneficial for all PMEs.
And so with respect to the grants and contributions, I can say that it's not, the policy application is not meant to be exclusionary. And so that means we want to be inclusive of those small and medium enterprises. And we can see that by the diversity of the programming. So where departments have programs that are targeting those more specific niche areas where small and medium enterprises are operating, they are encouraged to take that into consider as they apply the Buy Canadian policy. So that's very much on their mind.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
So we'll go to Mrs. Jansen for 3 minutes.
Okay, is there a single government-wide definition of Canadian? By Canadian?
So for grants and contributions, we're leveraging the work that has been done by PSBC.
So there's no single government-wide definition then? Okay. Okay, so I guess I can't ask that next. Are there federal crown corporations currently exempt from the Buy Canadian policy?
So first, there is a definition of Canadian supplier. It's ingrained in the Buy Canadian policy, and that is consistent.
Okay, so that was a yes then to that other question?
Yes.
Okay.
For crown corporations, there are 35 crown corporations that we can direct, and they have been directed by order in council. There are 9 crown corporations that are not subject to the government's power to direct, but those crown corporations were provided letters of expectation, highlighting the expectation that they follow Buy Canadian.
Does the Buy Canadian policy apply to procurement conducted outside Canada by federal organizations, or is foreign-based procurement excluded as an exception?
I believe that is one of the exceptions under the PSPC policy, but the specifics of that would be in their policy.
Have any federal entities formally requested exemption?
Treasury Board is not privy to that exception process.
So you don't know how many exemptions have been granted so far?
PSPC would be best placed to answer that question.
Are exemptions publicly reported?
I do not believe so, no.
You mentioned that with this policy, it extends to grants, contributions, loans, infrastructure spending, and Crown Corps. Has Treasury Board fully implemented those requirements government-wide?
We have communicated those requirements government-wide.
Communicated them, okay. If not, which funding streams are still excluded?
None of those funding streams are specifically excluded.
Has the directive on transfer payments been amended to reflect Buy Canadian requirements?
The policy as written did not require an amendment. It fully incorporates and is able to accommodate the Buy Canadian policy.
Okay. Are departments currently operating under interim guidance, or?
So we have issued guidance to all departments and agencies from TBS in order to implement that in their programs.
Has Treasury Board identified areas where the policy cannot realistically be enforced?
That's the requirement of responsible ministers to make that identification.
Are there programs where Buy Canadian is voluntary rather than mandatory?
That would be up to departments to assess. I think where they are not applying it, they are still encouraging it.
When will departments be fully compliant?
To grants and contributions specifically?
Sure.
So with respect to grants and contributions, all departments have so far complied with the requirements to assess their programs by February 16th.
When will all Crown Corps be fully compliant?
I don't have the information on Crown Corps. I don't know if my colleague does.
Crown corporations were directed on January 9th to comply with the policy, and we have no indication that they're not. They are required to report annually in their corporate plans, and so that may be an indication.
Okay, one more question. If a supplier believes a competitor falsely claimed Canadian content, is there a formal challenge process?
There are existing formal challenge processes within federal procurement that they can leverage.
Will audit findings be made public?
Audits that are conducted as part of internal audit are made public on departmental websites.
Great, thank you. Ms. Rochford, please.
Thank you. Keely, my colleague was going to ask you a question about framework, the instruments that are will be supporting, I guess, as you roll out the policies. I was just wondering, with respect to departments and crown corporations, will they be the same, or will there be some differences?
Good question. With respect to departments, the guidance and the framework that we've issued is the one that we've drafted by Treasury Board. And so this applies to all departmental grants and contributions. As I indicated before, there's roughly over 700, and to date, according to the assessment, they're looking at over 400 that have indicated that Buy Canadian can apply. I can't speak to Crown Corps, but I do understand there was alignment.
Oh, there was alignment.
Yeah.
Jen. In general, as you work as well with provinces and municipalities, Indigenous communities, do you expect that, I guess the collaborative approach that you've described to some extent, that there will be opportunities to strengthen the policy moving forward?
Yes, as part of the implementation, we intend to continue to collaborate with our departmental colleagues. They would be the ones, because they are, as per the policy, responsible for delivering their programs. So they would be engaging with provinces and territories and Indigenous communities themselves. But the expectation through implementation is that TBS would take lessons learned and share that across the community.
Okay, good. I think that's probably my time. So thank you very much for the opportunity for the additional questions.
Great, thanks very much. I just have a quick question, and I apologize, I wasn't paying as much attention. There are some Crown Corps are not subject to, would you be able to provide, like, we're short of time, would you be able to just provide it to us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for being with us again today. We appreciate all the answers, and we'll see you again. We are dismissing you. Colleagues, before we go, quickly, the budget came out, was sent to everyone for this study. If we can just get approval on it. Wonderful, so done. Our first report stage of the CER report is this Thursday. The second hour, we'll go on camera for that. Suggest that you put in your recommendations by this Friday at noon in both languages to the analysts, and then they'll start the process of taking a look of any overlapping ones. But if you could do that by noon. And Thursday, we are also...
Did you mention it needs to be in both official
languages? Yeah, I said both languages. Thursday, we will have, after the PBO, we're going to be voting on the mains. That should take about 30 seconds, but just a heads up. And one last issue with our schedule we had as part of this study and part of the motion we agreed on was inviting Minister Lightbound. Unfortunately, it's becoming a habit, they've declined to attend. I know Ms. Suds, who is with us often, is the PARLSEC, so I'm going to suggest that when perhaps Mr. Danko can talk to Ms. Suds, and we can try again to have a commitment from the Minister to attend on this important issue, maybe not on the 9th, but at a later date. Mrs. Block.
Can I speak to that?
Briefly,
Really
yes.
quickly, briefly. You know, when we decided to undertake this study, it was unanimously supported by all members. Obviously, that's what unanimously support means. But there was no hesitation when the plan included to bring the minister at the end of the study so that we would have an opportunity to ask him some questions about this policy. And so I guess I'm again very disappointed and concerned that we have Minister Lightbound once again refusing to appear before a committee on something that clearly falls within his portfolio. And I want to put that on the record. As you noted, it's becoming a habit. When he decides he's not going to come, he doesn't have to. And I think it's incumbent on ministers to come and defend their budgets, their policies. This is a huge one, and I think it's extremely important. I've been hearing from stakeholders and folks in industry who say it's not as cut and dry as it first appears, that there are issues with procuring with the government under this policy or even understanding it. So it would be good for the minister to come, and I guess I would appeal to my colleagues across the way to have another conversation with the minister to see if they couldn't change his mind.
Yeah, it's a large platform, and I do understand from Mr. Danko nodding that we will make an attempt. But go ahead, sir.
Yeah, just briefly, and I appreciate the attention to this issue. I totally agree. It's a very important issue that Canadians are very much seized with at the moment. You know, I think we have 3 meetings scheduled to the end of June on this specific study. And from our perspective, you know, we're really interested to hearing from the expert witnesses, the people in the industry to provide their feedback. But I'll certainly take back the committee's request to the ministry and provide you with a further answer there. Thank you.
Perfect. Perhaps after we've had more witnesses and some more testimony, it might be perhaps in his mind a more appropriate time. Mr. Chair, just briefly. Yeah, briefly.
Sorry. I think the motion said it was no less than 3 meetings, so I think there's room for us to be able to add a 4th meeting to make sure that we can accommodate the minister coming as well, so we could be make sure we can get him there.
We're always very flexible around the minister's time, regardless of what the minister is. If there's nothing else, we will adjourn and we'll see everyone Thursday. Thank you very much.